Will I or won't I give the patient a blood transfusion? It's a daily agonizing problem for hospital clinicians. Often the choices are based on flawed logic. In this tutorial, we're going to move back to normal physiology and look at the circulation, the hemoglobin concentration, oxygen delivery and consumption, and the indications and processes of blood transfusion.
Tutorial 8, the macro circulation. Previously, we've covered the stress response to critical illness, third space fluid loss, capillary leak syndrome, and why resuscitation fluids are different to maintenance fluid. This time I will discuss the distribution of blood in the body, a thing I call circulation prime, blood loss and oxygen delivery, and transfusion. Let's start with a clinical scenario. You were called to the emergency department. Jack is a 24-year-old motorcyclist that's been hit by a car, and he's been brought to the emergency room. He has multiple long bone fractures, a fractured pelvis, multiple lung contusions. On his labs, his hemoglobin is 12.6 grams per deciliter, his heart rate is 120, and his blood pressure is 100/60. Here's the question. Does Jack need to be fluid resuscitated? Well, to answer this question, we need to look at the macro circulation. Hopefully you're familiar with these. This is a milk carton or a juice carton or a big bottle, and each one of these represents 1 liter, and this red box here is 1 liter. And for the following slides, just think of that box as being 1 liter. First of all, the total volume of blood in the body is 5,000 mils. 5,000 mils. Of this, 1,000 mils or 20% is in the splanchnic circulation. This is the blood that is flowing to the stomach, the liver, the pancreas, the small bowel, the large bowel, the spleen, etc. 20% is in the splanchnic circulation around the organs. There are about 850 mils of blood in the heart and in the lungs, and that's separated out at about 300 mils in the heart, and the pulmonary vessels contain 550 mils. The brain only has 125 mils of blood in it. So when you're looking at the circulation that is not the heart and lungs, the systemic circulation, you're looking at 4,150 mils. Now this includes the splanchnic circulation. Of that, arteries and arterioles only have 650 mils, that's the arteries, and the arterioles another 350 mils. So arteries 650 mils, arterioles and the capillaries 350 mils. So we have about 1 liter in our arteries. Where's the rest of the blood? The rest of the blood is in veins. 3,200 mils, or 2/3 of blood volume is in the veins. Now, if you look at blood flow per minute, the right-sided cardiac output is 5,000 mils and the stroke volume is 70 mils. The left-sided cardiac output is 5,000 mils and the stroke volume is 70 mils. But the pulmonary vessels are only 450 mils. And these systemic vessels are 4,150 mils. So there is 10 times the amount of blood flow going into the pulmonary vessels as there is the systemic vessels. And indeed, if you look at the blood flow through the body, it's quite variable. The brain gets about 750 mils per minute, the liver 1,000 mils per minute, the kidneys 1,000 mils per minute, the bowels 750 mils per minute, the muscles 1,000 mils per minute at rest. Obviously, it ramps up massively during exercise. But that only tells part of the story. If you look at the amount of flow per unit mass of tissue, the brain gets 50 mils per 100 grams, so it gets a lot of flow. The liver even gets more flow than that, 100 mils per 100 grams. But the muscles only get 1 to 4 mils per 100 grams, so they're relatively underperfused, but there's a lot more of them, and there's a large volume of muscle in the human body. Now, this is what I call the normal circulation. And you can see here there's a heart, there's a brain, there's an arm, and then there's all kinds of visceral organs. And If you were to do some measurements on this, if you check the blood pressure on the arm or on the aortic arch, the mean arterial pressure is usually around 65 millimeters of mercury, and that's really important because that's what perfuses the brain, the mean arterial pressure. And indeed, blood flow auto-regulates to be kept within that particular range. The diastolic blood pressure that perfuses the endocardium is about 55 millimeters of mercury. And then the central venous pressure varies from patient to patient. That's the pressure in the right atrium, is roughly 0 to 3 centimeters of water. Now, of this, what's on the screen here, this bit here, the heart and the brain, is what I call circulation prime. No matter what happens to the body, it will always try to make adjustments to ensure that the blood flows from the heart to the brain. Of course, the heart must be maintained to perfuse the brain, but that is the primary responsibility of the heart in a critical situation, to keep the brain going. Everything else gets sacrificed, and that's why during the stress response you get this intense vasoconstriction around the extremities and in the splanchnic circulation. So the extremities and the splanchnic circulation are what I call the secondary circulation, and these circulations run in parallel. Now, this picture just shows the secondary circulation. In the middle there, is the splanchnic circulation, and at the bottom is the extremities. The mean arterial pressure is usually about 65, and the CVP is about 3 centimeters of water. Hemoglobin, let's just make it 15 grams per deciliter. The hematocrit is 45%, and the circulating volume is 5,000 mils. Now, if a patient loses a lot of blood, in this case 2 liters of blood loss for whatever reason, there is intense vasoconstriction and the circulating volume drops quite considerably. But what's interesting is if you were to go and measure the mean arterial pressure, it would be unchanged at 65 millimeters of mercury. And if you were to measure the central venous pressure, it would also be unchanged at 3 centimeters of water. And the reason for this is to maintain flow through the body, the circulation prime. And that's why neither of these measurements are particularly helpful when you're trying to look at circulating volume. Now, you may have noticed that at the bottom here, that hemoglobin didn't change. And if it does change in this situation of pure blood loss, it changes very little because hemoglobin is misleading. It really only tells you the concentration of hemoglobin, or indeed the hematocrit, per unit blood, usually 100 mils. And just like containers containing your favorite soda, whether it's a 2 liter, 1.5 liter, 64 ounce, 330, it doesn't matter. The concentration of the cola is always the same, irrespective of the volume of the device that's holding it. And the hemoglobin only falls in the bloodstream when lost blood is replaced by water, initially by transcapillary refill and by auto-resuscitation. It'll drop a smidgen. But when you start to give the patient crystalloid, that hemoglobin drops precipitously. Now, Jack has lost 2,000 mils of whole blood. And if you look at whole blood, it looks a bit like this. It's 45% red cell mass. That is really technically intracellular fluid. The red cells contain about 55% water, and then there's protein, and there's some potassium and calcium. And then the rest is 55% plasma that contains about 60 grams of protein. 2/3 of that is albumin, 1/3 of that is globulin. And the rest of what's left in the blood is extracellular fluid that contains 140 of sodium, 105 of chloride, 4 of potassium, 24 of bicarbonate. The plasma volume is only about 3.5 liters. The rest is red cell volume, obviously. Now, with respect to Jack, who's been knocked off the bike, is this hypovolemic shock? Well, Jack will be cold and clammy and hyperadrenergic, irrespective of whether he's lost blood or not. He's been hit by a bike, he's badly injured, he's fractures all over the place, lung contusions, probably a couple of fractured limbs. So Oliguria is going to be expected as urinary output is going to be unhelpful. The CVP and the MAP I've already told you may actually look normal, and this can be misleading. And the hemoglobin is unhelpful because of intense vasoconstriction associated with pure blood loss. So in order to determine the need for resuscitation, you need some objective measures and you need some pragmatic measures. The objective measures are things like direct measurement of the stroke volume or stroke volume variability or pulse contour analysis. These are tools we will describe later in the course. And there are pragmatic measures such as, for example, the presence of a lactic acidosis, which would be likely present anyway because of the hyperadrenergic stress response, or more usefully, the presence of low mixed venous oxygen content. Usually with hypovolemic shock, the mixed venous oxygen saturation declines as the lactate goes up. And so there is, the mixed venous might be 50% and the lactate may be 5 or 6 millimoles per liter, but not always do they correlate that well. Let's discuss oxygen delivery and consumption. When you look at the oxygen content of blood, the best and easiest way to look at this is to use this formula, which is 1.34 times the hemoglobin, that's the hemoglobin binding capacity for oxygen, times the saturation divided by 100, plus 0.03 times the PaO2, which is the oxygen solubility. The latter now really relies on Henry's law, and under normal atmospheric conditions it's not particularly important, but under hyperbaric conditions in a hyperbaric chamber, yeah, it's important. The big player here though is the hemoglobin. Nearly all the oxygen in blood is carried by hemoglobin. The saturation divided by 100 is determined really by two things: the alveolar gas equation and the alveolar to arterial oxygen gradient and the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. This, of course, reports the oxygen content per 100 mils, and the reason for this is because hemoglobin is traditionally reported per 100 mils. For example, 15 grams per deciliter, where a deciliter is 100 mils. If the PaO2 is 100 millimeters of mercury, how much oxygen is dissolved in the blood? Well, you take 0.03 times the PaO2, and if the PaO2 is 100 millimeters of mercury or 13 kilopascals, then 0.03 by 100 equals 0.3 mils per 100 mils. And this is a negligible amount. And incidentally, as most oxygen therapy is targeted at about 100 to 120 millimeters of mercury, it's nearly always the same. So if you're figuring this out, just put in 0.3 mils. When we look at oxygen delivery, this is known as DO2. We're looking at the oxygen content per 100 mils multiplied by the cardiac output. So this is 1.34 times the hemoglobin times the saturation over 100 in 100 mils, okay, plus 0.03, which we've already figured out, times the cardiac output, which is usually in and around 5,000 mils, 5 liters. If the hemoglobin is 15 and the saturation is 100% and the cardiac output is 5 liters, what is the oxygen delivery per minute? Let's work the problem. This is 1.34 times the hemoglobin times the saturation over 100 plus 0.03 times the cardiac output. 1.34 times 15 times 1 plus 0.3, and all of that works out at 20 mils per 100 mils. 1 mil will contain 0.204 mils of oxygen. So if you multiply that by 5,000, you'll get 1020 mils per minute. So that's 1,020 mils of oxygen delivered per minute, assuming that everything is normal and the hemoglobin is 15. This number here, the 20.4 mils per 100 mils, is the arterial oxygen content. And that's really important because we can now look at oxygen consumption. And Oxygen consumption, or V with a dot over it, O2, is the cardiac output times the arterial oxygen content minus the venous oxygen content in mils of oxygen per minute. And it really tells us how much oxygen is extracted per minute. That equation, incidentally, is known as the Fick equation. The hemoglobin is 15 and the mixed venous oxygen saturation is 75%. What is the venous oxygen content? Well, this looks like the same equation, but you can see in here we've put the mixed venous oxygen saturation over 100 instead of the arterial oxygen saturation. So that was 75%, so we can put in 1.34 times 15, hemoglobin's 15, times 0.75 plus 0.03 oxygen that's dissolved in blood, and this works out at 15.4 mils per 100 mils. To calculate out the oxygen consumption, then we have our mixed venous oxygen content of 15.4 mils per 100 mils. We already know the arterial oxygen content, so it's arterial minus venous multiplied by cardiac output is equal to oxygen consumption. Arterial was 20.4, venous 15.4, and that works out at 5 mils per 100 mils. That's the oxygen consumption, 5 mils per 100 mils, or 0.5 mils per mil. You multiply that by 5,000 and you come up with 215 mils per minute. And that is the standard oxygen consumption, all other things being equal. Now, if we were to map this, here we have our hemoglobin of 15, arterial content 20.4, venous content 15.4, saturation 100%, blood volume 5,000 mils, and our oxygen extraction is 250 mils per minute. The cardiac output of 70 mils times 70 beats, roughly 5,000 mils per minute, we deliver 1,020 mils per minute of oxygen. With this, the mixed venous oxygen saturation is 75%. Imagine now a situation where 2 liters of blood has been lost. The blood volume is now 3,000 mils, but strangely, the hemoglobin is 15 grams because the patient has just lost blood, not being resuscitated. The arterial content is 20.8 mils per 100 mils. It hasn't changed. The saturation is 100%. The cardiac output is much lower. Now we have a smaller stroke volume with a faster rate. So it's 30 mils multiplied by 100 beats, or 3,000 mils. And this gives us an oxygen delivery of 624 mils per minute. Quite a big drop. Remembering that the oxygen consumption is more or less the same. It doesn't change much, 250 mils of oxygen. As a consequence, you're now extracting more oxygen per unit flow, and as a result of that, the mixed venous oxygen saturation is lower at 45%. And that is why mixed venous oxygen saturation is a handy way of determining if the patient has absolute blood loss, particularly in trauma situations. If you were to measure the CVO2, the mixed venous oxygen content, will be significantly diminished. In this case, 8 mils per 100 mils. Now, let's go and restore Jack's circulating volume with crystalloid. Here we start with his blood volume of 3,000 mils, and we're going to give him volume. We're going to give him 2 liters or 3 liters or whatever it takes to get his blood volume up to 5,000 mils. Note immediately that the hemoglobin has now dropped. His hemoglobin is now 8 grams per deciliter. The arterial oxygen content is 10.7 mils per 100 mils. Cardiac output is back to normal, but his oxygen extraction is the same. So his cardiac output 5,000 mils, but his oxygen delivery much lower, 536 mils per minute, as a direct consequence of this low hemoglobin. So how do you figure out what the mixed venous content is, or the mixed venous oxygen saturation is? How do we work this out? VO2 CaO2 minus CVO2. We know that the arterial content is 11 mils per 100 mils by doing our usual calculation, 1.34 times 8 grams of hemoglobin times 100 plus 0.03. The CVO2 is per 100 mils is unknown, but we do know that the oxygen consumption is 5 mils per 100 mils as we've seen before. So the CVO2 must be 11 minus 5, which is 6 mils per 100 mils. Then we can feed this back into the equation. 1.34 times 8 times unknown SVO2 over 100 plus 0.3 is 6 mils. So working this out, this will give us an SVO2 of 53%. Go figure. Despite restoring vascular volume, the oxygen delivery actually falls. There are two other potential issues here also with crystalloid resuscitation. The first issue is the problem of fluid redistribution into the interstitial space and the problem of fracking of the interstitial matrix and edema formation. The second is an impact on coagulation. Now this is kind of controversial. Crystalloids definitely impact coagulation. But the problem is that most studies compare crystalloids with colloids. It is likely that crystalloids in low doses increase coagulation, but in higher doses they impair it, and you get a dilutional coagulopathy. We also know that crystalloids may also disrupt clots by increasing flow and increasing bleeding risk, particularly when the source of the bleeding has not been fully controlled. In general, it is better to replace blood loss in trauma with blood. I thought I might just show you a few of the blood products that we use, and this is variable throughout the world. This is 1 unit of red cell concentrate, often known as packed red cells. It contains about 220 mils of red cells and about 80 mils of plasma. The other product that's widely used is plasma. Often frozen plasma, sometimes known as fresh frozen plasma. This is a product that is used in my hospital. It's a manufactured product known as Octaplas, and this is manufactured from pooled human plasma. It contains about 60 grams per liter of plasma protein, so about half the albumin that you would normally have in plasma. And it also contains clotting factors and immunoglobulins. And in each bag of this, there is roughly 200 mils of plasma. There are a few other, there's some sodium citrate and quite a lot of sodium in there, but that's what's in there. Now, the other product that's widely used is a pool of platelets. And this is platelets from 5 or 6 donor. A pool contains 6 units, which is the equivalent to 6 units of red cells or 6 units of plasma. The volume in this 6-unit pool is about 300 mils, and the platelet count is 284 to 300. So, you get a fairly juicy transfusion of platelets from one of these pools. Now, what kind of resuscitation strategy should you be using? Well, it's kind of unclear the best way to do it. Certainly, it's not unacceptable to give a small amount of crystalloid to get the patient started with their resuscitation. In very small quantities, isotonic crystalloid can replace lost blood volumes, but as this starts to mobilize across the extracellular space, you do need to start increasing the volume. The initial fluid that you give is quite effective at volume expansion, but the more and more crystalloid you give, the more you actually have to give to expand the vascular space. So you need to be careful. A little bit of crystalloid, not bad. And after that, well, you just have to consider that you need to move on to blood products. Sometimes the amount of crystalloid given becomes geometrical if you're trying to find some way of restoring blood pressure. So modern strategies for resuscitation really is damage control. You give early aggressive blood product resuscitation. Now, you need to be aware that if you're using a sodium lactate solution like Hartmann's or lactated ringers, there is sodium citrate in the blood and there's calcium in the lactated ringers. So it is quite possible that you could actually clot the blood in the tubing if you use the same tubing for crystalloid and for blood products. This is not a problem with products like Plasmolite or Normasol because they don't contain calcium, they contain magnesium. What ratio should you be giving these blood products? Well, conservatively, 2 units of red cells for every unit of plasma, and platelets, remembering the platelets is 6 units in 1. Now, you may end up having to use other stuff like albumin, although there's plenty of albumin in the plasma, and you may also need to use some other blood factors such as fibrinogen. You might want to go to a 1:1 ratio for someone who's bleeding extensively. But the key thing in trauma is to resuscitate the patient, control the source of bleeding, and avoid fluid overload. And later in the course, I'll look at some of the complications of fluid overload in trauma specifically, one of which is abdominal compartment syndrome. Let's review this tutorial. In this tutorial, we covered blood volume and distribution in the body, oxygen delivery, oxygen extraction, and mixed venous oxygen saturation. We also looked at the hemodynamic response to blood loss and what the hemoglobin concentration means, and a simple resuscitation strategy in trauma. Next time I'll discuss venous return versus cardiac output, the concept of the mean systemic pressure, and stress blood volume versus vasopressors.
Okay, that was the macrocirculation, blood loss, oxygen delivery and consumption, and transfusion. Congratulations, you have now completed Module 2 of Part 1 of this course.